What is approaching the United States coastline right now is not a routine seasonal storm, not the kind of weather event that meteorologists track with professional interest, but without personal alarm, not the kind of system that the National Hurricane Center issues advisories about as a matter of standard procedure, while privately assessing the risk as manageable and the potential for catastrophic impact as limited. What is approaching right now is something that the atmospheric scientists, the hurricane specialists, the storm surge modelers, the emergency management professionals, and the meteorological community as a whole are describing with a language of urgency, of alarm, and of genuine fear that the most experienced and most scientifically rigorous members of that community reserve for only the rarest and most genuinely dangerous weather events, the kind of storm that appears in the historical record as a before and after moment for the communities in its path. The kind of system whose approach demands not the routine preparation that a coastal resident knows how to conduct, but the most serious, most comprehensive, and most urgently executed emergency response that individuals, families, communities, and government agencies at every level are capable of mounting in the time that remains before a storm of this scale and this intensity makes landfall and begins inflicting the kind of damage, the kind of devastation, and the kind of human suffering that only the most powerful and most destructive weather systems on Earth are capable of producing at the scale that the current forecast track and the current intensity projections suggest this storm is capable of delivering to the communities that lie in its path. The storm is growing stronger, and that three-word phrase, as simple and as straightforward as it sounds, carries within it a weight of scientific and human consequence that requires careful unpacking to fully appreciate. Because a storm that is growing stronger as it approaches a populated coastline is not simply a storm that will be more intense at landfall than it would have been if it had maintained its current intensity. It is a storm that is in the process of rapid intensification, a meteorological phenomenon in which a tropical cyclone's maximum sustained winds increase by 35 miles per hour or more within a 24-hour period, a process driven by the convergence of warm ocean waters, low wind shear, high atmospheric moisture, and favorable upper-level atmospheric conditions that together create the most favorable possible environment for a tropical cyclone to extract energy from the ocean surface and convert that energy into the organized convection, the tightening eye wall, the dropping central pressure, and the strengthening winds that together define the rapid intensification process, and that can transform a manageable Category 2 hurricane into a catastrophic Category 4 or Category 5 system in a time window, so short that emergency managers, evacuation planners, and the residents of threatened communities may not have adequate time to respond to the upgraded threat with the urgency and the comprehensiveness that the upgraded storm demands. The warm ocean waters that are fueling this storm's intensification represent one of the most consequential and most scientifically significant aspects of the current situation, because the sea surface temperatures across the region of the Atlantic or Gulf through which this storm is currently tracking are not simply warm in the ordinary seasonal sense of warm summer ocean temperatures that tropical cyclones always encounter when they form and develop during the Atlantic hurricane season. They are anomalously warm in ways that reflect the broader pattern of above normal ocean heat content that has been documented across the tropical Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico in recent years, and that represents one of the most important factors driving the trend toward more intense and more rapidly intensifying tropical cyclones that the scientific community has been documenting with increasing confidence and increasing alarm over the past several decades of hurricane observation and analysis. Ocean. Heat content, the total amount of thermal energy stored in the upper layers of the ocean rather than simply the temperature at the very surface, is the fuel that tropical cyclones run on. And when the ocean heat content is exceptionally high, as it is across the region through which this storm is currently tracking, the storm has access to a virtually unlimited supply of the thermal. Intensity against the wind shear and the dry air intrusion and the other environmental factors that would normally limit or weaken a tropical cyclone as it moves through varying atmospheric conditions, and to continue intensifying even when it encounters conditions that would stop a weaker or more typical storm from growing any stronger. The wind shear environment through which this storm is currently moving, the difference in wind speed and direction between the lower and upper levels of the atmosphere, a factor. That is among the most important determinants of whether a tropical cyclone can maintain its organized convective structure and continue to intensify, or whether the differential wind forces at different altitudes will tear apart the storm's circulation and prevent or limit intensification, is currently exceptionally favorable for continued strengthening, with atmospheric models showing low shear conditions persisting across the storm's projected track for the critical intensification period before landfall, meaning that the atmospheric environment is not going to provide the natural limiting mechanism against further strengthening that higher shear conditions would impose. and that the storm is essentially free to continue extracting energy from the warm ocean surface and converting it into increasing wind speeds and dropping central pressure for as long as it remains over water and as long as the favorable atmospheric conditions persist. The projected track of this storm, the path that atmospheric models are forecasting it, will follow as it moves toward the United States coastline under the influence of the large-scale atmospheric steering patterns that guide tropical cyclone movement, is a track that carries profound and immediate consequences for the specific communities, the specific coastlines, and the specific populations that lie along the projected path, and that are now in the position of having to make urgent, potentially life-altering decisions about evacuation, shelter, and preparation, based on a track forecast that carries the inherent uncertainty of all weather predictions, but that the ensemble of atmospheric models is projecting with a consistency and a confidence that leaves little doubt about the general area of threatened impact, even if the precise landfall location remains subject to the track variability that even the best modern forecasting systems cannot entirely eliminate. The storm surge, the abnormal rise in seawater level along the coast produced by the wind and low pressure of a hurricane pushing water ahead of the storm as it approaches land, is the aspect of this particular storm, that emergency, managers and meteorological experts are expressing the most intense concern about, because the combination of the storm's current intensity, its projected intensification before landfall, the specific orientation of the coastline relative to the storm's projected approach angle, the shallow bathymetry of the offshore waters along the threatened coast, and the astronomical tide cycle that will coincide with the storm's arrival are all factors that the storm surge models are incorporating into projections of coastal inundation that represent some of the most serious and most life-threatening surge values that have been projected for any storm M threatening the United States coastline in recent memory. Storm surge is consistently the deadliest aspect of landfalling hurricanes, responsible for the majority of hurricane-related fatalities in the historical record, killing people not through the violence of hurricane-force winds, but through the terrifying and inescapable reality of rapidly rising water that can flood homes to the roofline in a matter of hours, that can trap people who delayed evacuation in structures that are structurally sound enough to survive the wind, but that offer no protection against the drowning that occurs when storm surge water rises faster than the trapped residents can reach higher ground or higher floors within their home. And that creates the specific and deeply tragic category of hurricane fatalities, in which people who thought they had made a reasonable decision to shelter in place rather than evacuate found themselves facing rapidly rising water with no escape route and no possibility of rescue in the conditions that a major hurricane at landfall creates for emergency responders attempting to reach people in immediate danger. The rainfall projections for this storm add another dimension of catastrophic potential to what is already an extraordinarily dangerous situation, because a storm of this intensity moving at the track speed and following the atmospheric steering pattern that the models currently project will produce rainfall totals across a broad swath of its landfall region and inland track that could rival or exceed the rainfall from some of the most destructive and most expensive flood events in American history, with the heaviest rainfall potentially concentrated over areas where the topography, the soil saturation, and the drainage infrastructure create conditions that are particularly vulnerable to the kind of rapid and extreme freshwater flooding that catastrophic rainfall totals produce when they fall faster than the landscape. And the drainage systems can process and channel the water away from populated areas. The combination of storm surge, flooding from the coast, freshwater flooding from catastrophic rainfall, and the structural damage from hurricane-force winds creates a triple threat of overlapping and simultaneously occurring hazards that challenges the emergency response capabilities of even the best prepared communities. And that demands a level of individual and community preparation that goes significantly beyond the routine hurricane season, preparation that coastal residents are accustomed to conducting at the beginning of each storm season and revisiting when a storm enters the Gulf or the Atlantic Basin and begins tracking toward their general region. The evacuation decision, the most consequential decision that any resident of the threatened area will make in the time remaining before this storm makes landfall, is a decision that emergency management officials across the threatened region are urging residents to make now, immediately, without waiting for additional forecast updates, without waiting to see whether the storm maintains its current intensity or intensifies further, and without the understandable but potentially deadly tendency to delay evacuation in the hope that the storm will weaken, will shift its track away from your specific location, or will somehow fail to deliver the catastrophic impacts that the current forecast suggests it is fully capable of producing. The history of hurricane evacuations in the United States is a history that includes too many tragic cases in which residents who delayed evacuation to gather more information, to wait for a more certain forecast, or simply to avoid the inconvenience and the uncertainty of evacuation, found themselves trapped when the storm arrived, when the roads became impassable, when the storm surge began rising faster than they could escape, and when the decision that had seemed reasonable to delay became the decision that cost them their lives, a history. That emergency managers know intimately, and that informs the urgency and the unambiguity of the evacuation messaging they are now delivering to residents of the threatened areas who still have the time and the opportunity to make the decision that will keep them and their families safe. The preparation steps that residents of the threatened area who have already decided to evacuate should be taking right now include gathering and securing important documents, including identification, insurance policies, and financial records in a waterproof container, packing essential medications and medical equipment sufficient for at least a week beyond the expected duration of the storm and its immediate aftermath, securing their property as best as possible given the time available by boarding windows, securing loose outdoor items and turning off utilities at the main shutoffs, filling their vehicle with fuel before the storm-related demand surge depletes available supplies at local gas stations, identifying and confirming their evacuation destination and route, and departing as early as possible to avoid the contraflow traffic conditions and the fuel supply shortages that tend to develop as evacuation orders are issued and increasing. Numbers of residents attempt to leave simultaneously through a road network that was never designed to handle the volume of outbound traffic that a major hurricane evacuation generates. The residents who are in mandatory evacuation zones, the specific areas that local and state emergency management officials have identified as MOSA, vulnerable to storm surge, flooding, or other catastrophic storm impacts, and for which the order to evacuate is not a suggestion or a recommendation, but a legal directive based on a professional assessment that the risk to life from remaining in those zones exceeds the risk and the inconvenience of evacuation, should treat that order with the absolute seriousness that the authority and the expertise behind it reflects, understanding that the officials issuing mandatory evacuation orders are making those decisions based on the best available scientific information, the most current forecast data, the most detailed knowledge of local vulnerability, and the most comprehensive understanding of what happens to people who stay in mandatory evacuation zones. When a major hurricane makes landfall in those areas, the residents who are outside mandatory evacuation zones but within the broader area affected by the storm should be making careful and informed decisions about whether their specific situation, the construction type and elevation of their home, their proximity to water bodies, their personal health and mobility circumstances, their access to supplies and shelter within their home, and their realistic ability to shelter safely through a potentially multi-day period of severe storm conditions justifies sheltering in place, or whether a voluntary evacuation to a location outside the storm's impact area would represent a more prudent and more responsible choice given the extraordinary nature of the threat that the current forecast represents. The meteorological community's ability to forecast the track, the intensity, and the impacts of this approaching storm with the lead time and the accuracy that allows meaningful preparation and informed evacuation decisions represents an extraordinary achievement of scientific investment, technological development, and operational meteorological capability that has been built over decades of research, satellite technology development, hurricane reconnaissance aircraft operations, numerical weather prediction model development, and the accumulation of observational and scientific knowledge about tropical cyclone behavior that allows today's forecasters to provide warnings of a quality and a lead time that was simply not achievable even a generation ago, and the warnings that those forecasters are now issuing about this specific storm deserve to be taken with the full seriousness that the scientific credibility behind them warrants. The scientists who are tracking this storm, running the models, interpreting the data, and issuing the warnings that are now reaching the residents of the threatened areas are not sounding the alarm out of an abundance of caution, are not overstating the threat to ensure that people take preparation seriously, and are not engaged in the kind of precautionary overcommunication of risk that sometimes leads to warning fatigue and the tendency of people who have survived previous storm warnings without serious consequences to discount the urgency of current warnings based on their personal experience of past storms that did not deliver the catastrophic impacts that forecasters warned about. They are sounding the alarm because the data, the models, the atmospheric conditions, and the scientific understanding of what this specific storm is capable of producing are all pointing in the same direction, toward the same conclusion, with a consistency and a confidence that leaves no room for comfortable reassurance that this storm will be anything other than what the forecast currently suggests it will be. Prepare now. Evacuate. If you are in a threatened area, take this warning with the absolute seriousness that the scientists issuing it intend, and do not wait for a more certain forecast or a stronger mandatory order before making the decisions that could be the difference between experiencing this storm as a survivor and becoming one of the tragic statistics that the historical record of catastrophic hurricane landfalls includes too many of people who received the warnings, who had the time to act, and who made the decision to wait just a little longer before the opportunity to act safely closed and the storm arrived. Like this video, if this analysis gave you the complete, urgent, and genuinely important understanding of the monster storm approaching the United States coastline and why scientists are saying it is getting worse, subscribe to this channel for the kind of serious, scientifically grounded, and genuinely protective weather and natural disaster coverage that can make a real difference to your safety and the safety of the people you care about when the most dangerous storms in decades approach without adequate warning from the sources you depend on for information about the threats that matter most to your life and your community. And tell me in the comments where you are located relative to this storm's projected track and what preparation and evacuation decisions you are making in response to the extraordinary threat that this approaching monster storm represents. See you in the next one.